got really used to yesterday, last week, just getting to the grips with all the basics and things. The centering is one thing you've really got to work to master. Until you've done that, it's a bit boring. Well, not on this class, because I'll help you with centering play, you can still do other stuff, but you really want to work on that. And it's just like driving a car, learning an instrument, learning a new sport. It's all about training your muscles to do it until it becomes second nature. So I'll sit down and I'll go through in really I'll do a lot of detail about what you're trying to do and how you go about it. And we're probably going to spend most of the lesson really concentrating on that. I'll also show you how to do new shape. I'll show you how to do plates, because they're really nice when you're practicing doing the centering, because it's quite easy to chop off the wobbly bits. You'll see what I mean when I give it a go. So we'll focus on the centering, but I'll also give you a shape to try, so you can get a little bit more out of it as well. Alright, so this clay has been wedged, it's been kneaded, it's been packaged up into nice little balls and things. That's something we'll probably touch on next week or the week after. So it's been well mixed, there's no sort of really obvious layers, dry bits, wet bits, anything like that. But the texture itself is still uneven. What we're looking for is clay that's got the same density all the way through. At the moment, you're going to find pockets of harder clay, tougher clay, pockets of fluffier clay, and it just won't stretch out to the same extent. So what we're trying to do when we centre the clay is, yes, centre it neatly in the middle, but what you're really trying to do is put lots and lots of pressure into it. And once all that pressure goes through, it's the same density all the way through, then the behaviour changes, it stops being wobbly and awkward, and it starts being really, really smooth, and that's what you want to make your piece out of. So I'm going to start off just by making sure it's stuck down. You don't want to get water underneath the ball by accident, it will just slide straight off. So just a little water on your hands, just enough to stop it from sticking. And I'm going to rest my left hand just fairly gently on it to catch it if it flies off. And I'm going to use my right hand like a karate chop and start just by resting it, and then gradually increase the pressure until I think, yep, it feels like it's stuck and it's not going anywhere. And once it is stuck, you can move it around quite happily without unsticking it, that's fine. But whilst you've still got this undercut here, it's going to be very prone to slide and straight back off again. Hello, how are you doing? Alright, thank you. Cool. We're doing a centering coaching thing. Okay. Cool. So first thing I'm going to do is get that stuck down really well. Now you've basically got two motions you're doing here. You've got this motion where you squeeze the clay, and this motion where you push it back down to a neat ball again. So this is kind of the second motion. I've got my hands there, and I'm squeezing, pushing the clay down, and getting my fingers right in there to try and squish that down onto the bottom. Once you've got that shape, it's not going to come off unless you get something really touchy right. So I'll show you that in a little bit in more detail later when I show you what the second motion is. So you want to make sure you're using body weight for this. If you sit down and practice this and it's just sort of not working, chances are your seating position isn't quite right. So you want to be high enough so that all of your weight drops onto your arms to help you keep control of it. The strongest part of your hands is the heel, the bone right on the heel of your hands here. So this is what we're going to be using to put pressure into the clay. And it's really essential that any pressure you apply comes from the outside and travels directly to the middle. If it misses the middle, that's when it starts twisting and you're in big trouble, because that's really hard to get rid of. So whatever angle you do it, you really want to make sure it's going exactly to the centre of the clay. So for this technique, I'm going to start you off with two hands pushing the clay. One of them is directly at 9 o'clock, the other one is at 3 o'clock. And that's a pretty easy direction to squeeze, you just go straight to the centre. So really important you don't let your hands drift back, because then you can see how easy it is to miss the middle. So work on getting your hands exactly opposite. Then your fingertips, you want to curl around, one set of fingertips on the clay, the other set on the back of your hand. So this is the pressure lined up to get the squeezing done. This is what's going to help keep your hands in the clay nice and still. That shape here, where you've got an arch, that's really important. That's what's going to keep it strong and still. If your fingers are kind of flat or interlocked or flapping around, you can't keep control of it. You need that nice sort of Roman arch, that bridge shape, which is going to keep it really strong. So get into that position first. You can count to 4 to help you out with this. So 1, 2, 3, and then 4. You've always got the wheel started before you do anything. And then when you're ready, you can speed up and go for it. Now, just bear in mind that when you squeeze it and it gets narrower, the shape is going to get narrow, and your hands are going to change, the position of your hands. So what you want to avoid is bringing the heels of your hands together. because that puts the pressure in the wrong direction. You want to shrink your fingers over each other. So try and make sure that the heels of your hands stay in the same place, and it's your fingers that do something different. So get yourself nice and comfy, make sure everything's really relaxed, get your hands in exactly the right place, and then make sure your weight is over. And when you're ready and you're happy with your position, as much speed as you think you can control, and then you start squeezing the heels of your hands together at the bottom there. Don't, like as usual, when you're getting to grips or something, don't worry about stopping, putting some more water on, carrying on. You'll get better at not needing so much water later on. So the rest of the play at the top, until you get really big balls to play, that looks after itself. What you need to do is to squeeze the bottom. It's easy to squeeze and then lift your hands and the clay's thinner and it's easier, but you don't do the work you need to. You've got to keep them right at the bottom here and just keep squeezing. Now, no matter how hard you push the clay, it's quite difficult to penetrate force more than about an inch into clay. So letting it pop up like that when you squeeze it, that's really useful. Because if you've got a column that's a couple of inches across, then you know you're going to get right to the centre quite easily, and you're not going to miss bits of clay on the inside that you don't quite get it centred. So you let it pop up, squeeze the heels of your hands together until it's a kind of column shape. That's a pretty good start. You can see it's still pretty lumpy. It's going to feel like a pig the first time round, and then it gradually gets better as you do it a bit more. So that's the first movement, putting some pressure and letting it pop up into a nice column shape. The next thing is to squish it back down again so you can give it another go. So your left hand is basically going to be a mould, and the right hand squishes the clay into it. So this is the shape we want to end up with. This is your mould. So we're going to start there. Then you want to pick up your hand high enough so that the corner of the clay here sits in the corner of your hand, and that means you can put your whole thumb on top. And just by pushing on the small part of your hand, that gives you control over the whole top. So just a little push on here is going to give you a lot of control of the clay, and that's useful because it means this hand can move around a bit more. So if I start by pushing down on the thumb here, you'll see that quite quickly it starts forming a sort of mushroom shape, and you want to avoid that because that mushroom shape kind of rolls down, it traps clay and air and squishy stuff, and the clay just ends up shearing off. So what you do is you alternate between pushing down to get it squished and pushing the side to keep it nicely under control. So it's this kind of backwards forwards motion where I'm pushing down or I'm pushing from the side. So to get yourself in the right position for this, you've got your hand there to start with, then you pick it up and put your thumb on the top, heel of your hand again to do the squishing, and then just wrap it around so you're still pushing with the same place, but it's nice and easy to move and stay nice and steady. So you can count to 4 again with this. So 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So I'm going to start by pushing down a wee bit. Then once it starts feeling even slightly mushroomy, I'm going to push from the side, and then come back and push from the top, push from the side, and just rock my way down until it's a nice little hockey puck shape. So that's the kind of shape you want to end up with. If you don't quite get your hand position right, it's quite easy to end up with a sort of volcano shape. And what that means is that the clay up here and the clay down here is relatively thin. It gets waterlogged more quickly. So you end up with some clay that's relatively fresh and some clay that's quite squishy and will die a bit quicker. What you want to be doing is having a technique that means all of your clay stays as fresh for as long as possible. So that's why you want that kind of nice flat column shape. If you squish it down too flat, you're going to find it very difficult to bring back up again. So the sort of proportion you're looking for is about as wide as it is tall. You don't want to dip below that before you're ready to actually start making your piece. So I'll give you a little recap on that. So, heel of your hand, 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock, one hand and the other hand. Really good squeeze on the bottom. Stop and add more water if you need to, but don't let your hands move up, just let yourself squeeze. Now we need to come down again, so hand ready in its mould shape, just resting, then pick it up with your thumb on top, heel of your hand ready to push, and this hand wrapped around just to give it a bit more support. And I'm going to squish down. As soon as I get a hint of a mushroom, I'm going to drop my hand and push to the side. Now you can still, I'm always pushing with this part of my hand, the strong part of my hand, and whatever position I'm in, I'm always pointing directly towards the centre of the clay. I'm never sliding off to one side.
And you sort of move.
Yep. And exactly the exact position you hold your hands in this does depend slightly on how flexible the wrists are. Everyone's slightly different. So some people like me, I do it like directly in front of me, other people do it slightly onto one side. I'll help you work out what's more comfortable for you when you do it. But you don't want that mushroom to form at all. You want to keep that completely under control so that you don't trap any gooey clay that will cause you problems later. Good. Now when you're doing this, you are putting a fair bit of pressure into the clay. You shouldn't find that your muscles have to work. If you do, or you find you're maybe a bit sore about the neck or something, it means you're not doing it right, you're not using weight. But what you want is to generate power easily with your weight and put it straight into the clay. You don't want to put it into your joints, your wrists, your fingers or anything like that, where it will cause, RSI over time and things like that. So one really important thing to look out for when you're doing this is you want to see straight lines through your joints the whole time. You don't want to see any crooking one direction or another, or over or under. Everything wants to be completely straight. And then when you push, that power just goes straight into the clay. It doesn't get pushed into your hand. So you can see if I push like that, it just comes straight down the bone into the clay. If I push like that, then it bypasses, you lose some of the power in your wrist, you can potentially hurt yourself, and the clay doesn't cooperate as well. So it's always nice straight lines. So you should be having a nice equilateral triangle for this. So really comfortable, your weight resting, not too high, not too low, and really straight lines before you get in and you do your actual pushing. Same thing when you come up, so I'll show you. 1, 2, 4. Squeeze. So again, when you're coming back down again, this hand ready, that one on top, that one ready to push, hands bent over, and you can see I've still got really nice straight lines through my wrists. There's nothing kinky going on here at all. So to start with, this is just going to be about figuring out your position, making sure you're comfortable, you're in the right place, you know what you're aiming for. And then as you gradually get better at it, the main thing that you want to do is try and create as little friction as possible. If you're gripping the clay a lot, it's prone to twisting, and you also get a lot of gooey, gunky clay form on top. So if you do get a really gooey layer of clay, or if you're not sure what condition your clay is in, once you finish centering, there's absolutely no harm in just giving it a little scrape, because any gooey clay on the surface, it's not going to do your pot any good. You can just make sure you're down to the strong stuff. So creating as little friction as possible comes down to pushing with a very small part of your hand. So when you get good at this and you give it a good squeeze, you're going to see pretty much a sort of 50p pounds piece on the heel of your hand there. To start with, you're probably going to find you've got a much bigger area here, just as you get used to what to squish with. So that's one of the things to watch out for whilst you're working. It's not a bad idea to stop and look at your hands to see what you squish it with. You want to try and visualise, think of this part of your hand as you squish. When you pop the clay up, this is a really useful sort of telltale sign as to how well you're doing with the centering. If it's nice and flat, that's perfect. Or if it's a little domed, it means you're squishing the clay right in the centre that's popping up. If it's this kind of shape where it's dipped, it means you're not penetrating the middle, you're only pulling up the edges of the clay. So that's a really good sign that it's not quite in the right position, and you need to adjust what you're doing. Be a little bit careful about this. If you let this get deep, it's going to trap gooey stuff, which is going to cause you problems later. So if you see that happening, if you assume your second position, but rather than pushing on top, you push on the corner into the centre, you should find that you can squish it out. You might even need to dig this little gooey bit out. So as soon as you see it starting to dip, it's a good idea to just repair that shape before it gets really deep and really difficult to deal with. Right. Now, in practice, there's 3 ways I teach people to centre. You've got side to side, which does for most normal shapes. Very similar sort of thing, but for very tiny bits of clay, you might just use one heel to be squishing whilst the other hand supports it. And then when you get really big pieces of clay, you start using your body weight to shunt into the clay. And then when you've got all those 3, you tend to sort of segue between them. You do like a little bit of a combination each time. So I'll teach you to do like a very specific technique. But as you get more confident and you start doing different things, you'll find that you switch positions quite often. So we probably won't get much chance to do like really big chunks of clay or anything like that, but at some point I'll show you how to do it when you need a bit more power. But this is the one we'll focus on to start with, mostly because it's the trickiest one. So once you've mastered this, most other things are going to be pretty cool. Alright, so little recap. 1, 2, 3, 4. Squeeze the bottom of the clay, let it pop up. And don't let it get too skinny, too thin, you just want a nice sort of column shape. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. Push down and rock whenever you need to squish the side as well as the top. Now every time you do this, you mix in more water, more slurry into the clay, and that will weaken it. So don't do it twice, that's about perfect. 3-4 times, yeah, that's fine. By the time it's the 5th time, you don't really want to do it more than that. It's just not going to behave. So to start with, you may or may not get it centred in 5 goes, but I would still stop there anyway and just carry on, because otherwise you're making clay that's so weak you're not going to get a decent form out of it anyway. So this is where I move on to showing about plates, because you've got a few cheats here that can make your life a little bit easier. So the last bit that's going to get centred perfectly is the bit right in the centre, right at the bottom. So one little cheat you can do already is actually not to go very deep, to leave a nice big chunk on the bottom, and then the wobbliest bit you're going to miss altogether. So that's quite useful. And when you make plates, you generally want a really chunky bottom. Partly because when you cut a wire in something that's broader, it's always going to lift up and chop more off the bottom. And partly because if you've got a really nice chunky bottom, you can turn it and do some lovely shapes later on. So you can have a nice thick base in there. So I'm going to start by the usual little hole. I'll leave a good old chunk on the bottom. And then I'm going to start pulling out. Especially for a wider shape, you'll realise it's super important to press down on the rim rather than just pull out. So make sure you do have your fingers squished on top of the clay and you're pushing on the top as you pull out. Some really big bubbles in there. There we go. Alright, so if your clay isn't very well centred, you do have a couple of options where you can rejig things once you get started. So by doing what we'd normally do and getting the sponge and compressing, that would actually end up centering the bottom anyway. There's a little trick where you can actually centre the donut of the clay. So you have to find a position where the clay can't escape out of your fingers. Come in very still and squeeze hard, and it'll go back to being a round circle again. I won't show you how to do that today because that takes a little bit of practice, but it is a very useful little technique, so we'll cover it at some point. The nice thing about plates is that if your clay's wobbly, there's a super easy cheat, which is to bring the whole piece of clay flat. So don't even worry about leaving a lip. Just pull everything out, nice and flat. Do all the work that you'd normally do for centering, and then afterwards you can just chop off anything that's wonky, basically. So I'm going to do what I usually do, 3 or 4 times back and forth, nice bit of pressure, make sure it's really compacted. But if you think about it, the shearing force that's exerted on the centre, the wider the piece of clay gets, the bigger that force is. So unlike bowls, you need to spend a little bit more time on plates, making sure they're really strong. So you do what you usually do with a sponge, but then we're going to take it up a notch and we're going to use another tool to really compact it and make sure it's properly strong. Which I forgot to grab actually. Just behind you, there should be some wooden tools in that box with the reckoning. This is my favourite one for plates, just because it's nice and rigid. You don't want a flexy one for this. So once I'm done with the sponge, I'm going to use this the same way. You've got to get the angle right, usually just a nice shallow angle there, and do just the same thing. So you draw a line from the centre, out to the edge, back to the centre again, and again you don't want to see the shape change, you just want to compact the clay as much as possible. Now you can see how much thinner it's got just because of all the compacting work we've had to do, so you can see what I mean about really overdoing it, starting thick on the bottom. Also, when you pull the wire through, it's going to lift up slightly in the middle for a broader piece. So very often it cuts off more in the centre than it does in the edges. So what I tend to do is imperceptibly have it a little higher in the middle than it is on the outside. That's also very useful when you're using a tool like this, because if it's completely flat, it's quite easy to gouge in the wrong side, whereas if it's slightly tilted, then it just pops above the centre and it means you can't gouge it by accident. So when you're spreading out with your sponge, you can think about that and try and leave like a little bit of a hump in the middle. You can see how that's lifted slightly over the centre, and it makes your life a bit easier. So I'm going to go back and forth, make sure that's really compacted, and then when I'm happy about that, I can look at the rest. And if the outside is wonky, super easy to deal with this. You just stay nice and still, clutch your elbows into your ribs, draw a circle, all the way down, keep on going until it gets to the metal, and then chuck it in to chop the bottom as well. And then you can slice through that and just take off the ring. So you've finished centering any little bit of clay that's still wobbly, and you've chopped off all the gunky stuff around the edge. So if you've done your 5 pieces and it's still a bit on the wonky side, that's why it's quite nice to do plates, because you can just spread it out, centre it, and then to pop up a little bit of clay to actually make the edge of your plate, all you've got to do is just moisten it a little. The finger here to maybe guide the shape of things. Use the sponge and just shove the clay inwards, and it'll just pop up a little bit of extra clay for you to be the walls of your plate, the edges of your plate. So with plates, you tend to do a lot of work on the bottom and then you work on the edge. So whilst you're working on one part, you want to keep the other part dry so it's not weakening. So I'm going to try and keep this fairly dry and mop it up if it gets water on whilst I'm working on the edge here. And this is just like doing a shorter, shallower version of a bowl basically. So nice and moist. This hand ready, I say hand, fingertip or two. Same sort of thing, really nice squish from the bottom here, get that clay moving, bring it up, almost upright. So at this point, you've got a little bit of a choice about your shape. You can either treat it like a shallower version of the bowl, just a nice flat curve, or you can put in a sort of classic dinner plate shape where rather than just a curve, it's got that platter edge to it and then the little curve. So I'll show you how to do both shapes so you can have a little play with them. So start the usual way, get everything nice and dry. Give it that little tram around the bottom just to make sure it's nice and round. There's nothing sludgy in that corner. The red one gone again. Get everything nice and clean and dry on the outside. One little tip that's useful for plates, once you've flattened everything out, it's a little more awkward to try and do the sponge on the edge. So it's not a bad idea to do that before you do the shaping, just to keep that nice and clean. And then you can do your shaping. So do the usual thing, flatten out, get a nice broad curve, carry on to the centre. That's particularly nice if you want it like that little sort of spiral thing. With a really flat bottom, you might like to do the curve that way, but actually switch to using the flat at 3 o'clock if that's going to suit your style a little better. When you're stretching all the way out, it will imperceptibly stretch back up a little. It will actually perk up a touch. So go a bit flatter with the plate than you think you actually want it. So that sort of thing, for example, will perk up a little bit better than that was. Now if you want to do a dinner plate sort of thing, then make sure this curve down here is doing just what you want. It's got that nice little profile there. Get everything all sorted, all fabulous. And turning over the edge is the very last thing that you do. And you don't want to take overly long on this. If you spend it a little bit too long with the tool, it can vibrate and cause a weird edge, which isn't the end of the world. You can just turn it over, flatten it out when you're drying it. But better just to go in, make the shape, take your hand away and leave it. So you basically put the corner where you want the edge of your plate to be, and just 2, perhaps 3 revolutions. Just go for it. So get ready and then up. There we go. So that one's fairly shallow, but like I said, I'll flatten it down quite a bit because it will just have a little touch. Alright, so to recap, on plates particularly, make sure you are squashing down the rim as you pull out. If it feels a bit wonky, just keep on going until the whole bit of clay is flat. Then you can do your compressing with a sponge, then take it up a notch with the wooden tool, and then you can just chop off anything wonky. Squish back in to pop up some more clay. Don't worry if you don't remember all these bits, because it's the essential we're focusing on. I can remind you of those as we go. I think there's a wire in the bulb behind you. Thank you. You will get a much more accurate cut with a wire if you do it whilst the wheel is moving. So if you can get the confidence to do that, give it a go, especially for plates, cylinders and things like that. So just make sure your fingers are far enough apart that you're not accidentally going to squish them into your plate whilst you're cutting it off.
Have you done with it?
You always cut it dry and then you use the water just to help you slide it off. So
on the inside you'll have this sort of sharp angle here. Just take your finger and just gently.
Especially if you've got a good chunky bottom onto your clay, you shouldn't need to worry too much about wobbling it as it comes off. We can always lay it over on its top and flatten it down a bit later if you need. Thank you. So we can have a little bit of fun with that later. I'm just going to very quickly recap the centering because that's the most important thing. And then we can get you all with a full clay of your own. Okay. So it's going to be dry to stick. If you can aim, which I can't really, you can get it stuck in the middle, pull it over. Little bit of water, one hand resting, one hand like a karate chop on top, and then just give it a little press. Now if it does slide off, the best thing to do is to get in with your kidney, make sure this is dry, and make sure the clay is dry. If you pick a curvy side rather than a flat side, it'll make sure that you exclude any air bubbles by accident. So just clean that off so it's not sticky, slap it back on and give it another go. So just enough water to stop it sticking to your hands. Rest your hand on top karate style and just gradually push until it feels like it's not going to move. It won't take much. Then you're going to start off with your second hand position. So this hand ready, thumb right on top, feeling your hand on top there and then hold it on. And the idea is to use the heel of your hand, push it right into that corner down there. You can also use your little finger, that's quite useful. You just want to squeeze and maybe push the clay so that there's no gap under here anymore. Once that gap disappears, then it's not going to come off again. Until that point, you might find it slides off quite easily. Alright, so now you can do much more water, much more speed. 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sure you're nice and close and relaxing. Then use as much speed as you think you can control. Bring the heels of your hands together and let the clay pop up. Don't move your hands up, always keep them down right at the bottom there. And then once you're ready to pop it down again, this hand ready to go, lift it up, put your whole thumb on top. Notice how I've got this sort of triangle of flesh on top here. I don't have the thumb on top, I've got the whole joint on top. Heel of my hand around there, let it flop over for a bit of stability, and then I'm going to switch between pushing down and getting rid of the mushroom. And this is easy if you need a bit more force because you just lean over it a bit more. So I've got that nice squat column shape. Alright, so same again. 2, 3, 4. First one's always going to feel horrible. Then the second one's going to feel a bit better, the third one will feel a bit better. But like I said, it's not worth doing more than 5 times. Now the faster you can go, both with your movement and with the speed, the less friction you do. So especially when you're practicing this later on in other sessions, experimenting to see how much speed you can get away with is a really good idea. Some really big bubbles in there. I'm not making anything out of this. Alright, so a nice big squish. All the way down. So we'll get you set up, grab your a blob of clay, get you going. And like I say, if you don't want to make something, it's not a bad idea just to give it a scrape and make sure you don't have a really gooey layer on the outside there. There's a really big fat bubble in there. as well pop it to one side. Yeah, so if you want to grab yourselves your seats, pop yourself in that bucket. There's also another bucket behind Alago. Get in and have a go. If you need a reminder about those positions and they're accounted for, it's on the board there. And I'll come around to everyone, make sure that your position's good, everything's in the right place, and we'll figure out your sort of wrist positions and things as well. I'm just going to